Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being with us. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library, and this is our library book talks. Before we begin, I want to thank the Dean's Office for supplying lunch, and please continue eating while we go forward. Copies of today's book are on sale just outside of the room, so if you haven't picked one up already, please do. It's fascinating. I also want to let you know that today's talk and Q&A period will be recorded and it'll appear on the Law School's YouTube channel sometime next week. So let me get down to business and introduce our authors and panelists. And actually, before I do that, today's actually our final book talk of this semester. And so before we start, I just want to acknowledge June Casey, who coordinates all of our book talks. So thank you, June. Yeah, it's not the last book talk, it's just the final one of the semester. Okay, so let me get down to business. I'm going to speak very quickly so I can introduce our panelists and get going with this talk. So Sanford Levinson is the author of our book. He's the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law at the University of Texas Law School. Professor Levinson is also a professor at the UT Department of Government and was previously a member of the Department of Politics at Princeton. He's authored more than 350 articles and book reviews in popular and professional journals, as well as 6 books, including Written in Stone, the book that we're talking about today, Public Monuments and Changing Societies, Constitutional Faith, Wrestling with Diversity, Our Undemocratic Constitution, Where the Constitution Goes Wrong, and How the People Can Correct It, and Framed, America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance. At the far end, Jeff Jacoby has been a conservative columnist with the Boston Globe since 1994. After earning degrees from GW and BU Law School, Jacoby briefly practiced law, worked on several Massachusetts political campaigns, and served as an assistant to BU's president, Dr. John Silber. In 1999, he was the first recipient of the Randall Prize for Excellence in Opinion Journalism. Randall Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor of Law here at Harvard, where he teaches courses in contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He served as a law clerk for Judge Wright of the United States Court of Appeals and for Justice Marshall of the United States Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, and is a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and the Supreme Court of the United States. Thank you, thank you. In 1998, Professor Kennedy was awarded the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and the Law. His most recent books include For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law, The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics in the Obama Presidency, and Sellout, The Politics of Racial Betrayal. Professor Bruce Mann is the Carl F. Schipper Jr. Professor of Law here at Harvard and teaches American legal history, property, and trusts and estates. He has also taught as a visiting or permanent member of the faculty at the law schools of Washington University and St. Louis, the University of Connecticut, Houston, Texas, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. He's gotten around, and in the history department at Princeton. Professor Mann's publications include Neighbors and Strangers, Law and Community in Early Connecticut, a co-edited volume of essays entitled The Many Legalities of Early America, and articles and essays in various history journals and law reviews. Professor Mann is also a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society, and from 2011 to 2013, president of the American Society of Legal History. Okay, so over to our panelists for a really interesting, exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you first to the Harvard Law School Library for arranging this. I'm extremely grateful. And to all of you who have attended and my co-panelists, it occurred to me that I've known Randy and Bruce for a collective total of about 70 years. And I've never met Jeff Jacoby. I've read him with great interest. I probably disagree with him 90% of the time. But on 2 of the transcendent issues of our time, that is the use of torture and the fitness or unfitness of Donald Trump to be president of the United States, he has been a courageous voice in writing about that. And I read his columns always with interest, usually with disagreement, including his defense of gridlock in this morning's Boston Globe, but I genuinely look forward to what he has to say about the book, knowing that he will speak forthrightly and interestingly. So, as is true also of Randy and Bruce, but as I've known them for 70 years.
You disagree with them also 90% of the time?
No. No. I've put the timer on 10 minutes, and so I want to quit then in order for everybody else to say his piece and then to have some feedback from the audience. It might be easiest to show you the two editions. Larry Lessig, who's kind enough to be here, reminded me that he was at a Yale faculty workshop when I presented this version 20 years ago. And this has a picture of Jefferson Davis and the monument to Confederate war dead. That is literally the first thing that you see as you walk up the south entrance to the Texas State Capitol. It's still there, along with, since 2016, a monument to African Americans in Texas. And one of the things, in fact, I was in Austin 3 weeks ago for the Texas Book Festival with the co-panelist was the designer, Ed Dwight, of that monument. And one of the questions was whether it represented a separate but equal moment or some effort at genuinely interesting pluralistic inclusion of trying to put together the very tangled and complex history of the state of Texas. This is the new edition. It was originally envisioned as having about a 5,000 word afterword that I would have gotten in last year around August. Instead, it has a 20,000 word afterword, with the last words being added literally as the book was going to press, I think in June or July, because obviously a great deal has happened, including the removal of Robert E. Lee from his place of honor, or his statue's place of honor, in Lee Circle in New Orleans, which is one of the central public sites in New Orleans. New Orleans features in the book, as does Austin, as does Boston, as do places ranging literally from Albania to Zimbabwe. The monument to what I always call the aptly named White League is a very interesting and important and despicable part of New Orleans history. The book concludes, the new edition concludes with an analysis of what I regard as tied for first among great speeches delivered by active politicians in my lifetime. That is a speech by now former Mayor Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans, in which he was explaining in what I naively and desperately hope was a speech he wrote. I don't know what the answer is, but it's a remarkable speech, not only well worth reading, but also watching. It's tied for first, incidentally, with Lyndon Johnson's We Shall Overcome speech in 1965, which I can remember very vividly, but which was not written by President Johnson, but it certainly was delivered by him and was a transformative moment. But quite obviously, one of the things that has happened, particularly in the last year or so, is the removal of lots of monuments, the changing of lots of building names. Randy reminded me of the Balzac quote, "Behind every fortune lies a crime." And there's a lot of truth to that. I do have a chair at the University of Texas. It's a relatively new school. We, like all law schools, rely on generous benefactors, and one might not want to know the full biography of everybody who has been a very generous benefactor to the University of Texas, and I suspect, frankly, that's true of law schools and other institutions across the land. Indeed, the most recent controversy, and I find myself thinking only half jokingly of a 25th anniversary edition, because literally every day will bring new examples. The most recent controversy involves Bolt Hall at what is now officially called the University of California at Berkeley School of Law, but its principal building continues to be Bolt Hall. It turns out that Mr. Bolt was a raving white nationalist, anti-Chinese figure in the politics of the 1870s and 1880s. So for very, very obvious reasons, it is now very much a controversy as to whether or not Bolt Hall should retain its name any more than at Yale University, John Calhoun College should retain its name. And the answer, which I discuss in the now 20,000-word afterword, the answer at Yale was no. The answer at Princeton with regard to Woodrow Wilson, and Randy has been a member of the Board of Trustees of Princeton, where he was, we met 40 years ago when he was a student of mine. Princeton decided to keep the Woodrow Wilson School. And one of the factoids I note in the book is that the most common name for new high schools in Florida is Manatee, because it turns out just to be safer to name schools after fish or mammal-like, or fish-like mammals, or trees or rivers, rather than face the political problem of naming a school after a political figure, or even after a figure who was thought at moment T to be a fine, upstanding person. Think of Bill Cosby, who by one description has been a truly notable philanthropist. And then we discovered other aspects of Bill Cosby. And one could do that for lots of other figures. Sometimes with John Calhoun, there's no discovery. The Yale Corporation should have known in 1931 everything they needed to know about John Calhoun. But there are other interesting problems where historians bring up new sorts of material, and certainly one of the reasons that I'm so glad Bruce is here is because he had to confront, as chair of what I call the Mann Committee, the issue of the Harvard Law School shield, which prior to, I think, 2000, nobody had any idea what the metonymic association of the wheat sheaves, which looked like an innocent anodyne symbol, what their association was. So history can have a bite. Sometimes you learn that people were far better than you think they were. But that really is not going to present a problem. We don't name buildings or build statues to people we know at the time, or we think at the time, were really quite discreditable. The problem always emerges when new information comes out, and then we have to wrestle with the issue of whether we wish to preserve everything or readjust, especially what I call sacred public space. The soundbite for the first edition of the book, when people ask me, but it's also true of the second edition, is it Stalinist to tear down statues of Stalin? So that I begin the preface to the new edition by pointing out that, to my knowledge, nobody in this country objected to the tearing down of the monument of Saddam Hussein when Baghdad was conquered in 2003. Everybody thought that was a fine symbolic gesture because nobody believed that Saddam Hussein deserved to be honored. But there was destruction of a statue. So I've said literally more than enough. I've gone beyond the 10 minutes, and I'm really very eager to hear what everybody has to say.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. As has been indicated, I've known Sandy Levinson a long time. He's been a great teacher and mentor and friend. I guess I'm especially moved to be here because this book is written in stone. It's about memorialization, and it's especially close to my heart because in the book memorializes friends of Sandy's, and I'm one of those friends. So this is a book that's especially close to my heart. I'd like to put on the table a subject that, Sandy, you touch upon at the very end of your book. Doesn't get much play in the in conversations about struggles over historical memory and the politics of memorialization, but I think it should be on the table. So in these discussions, very often, you know, it's white men who are the subjects, whether it's Woodrow Wilson or whether it's John C. Calhoun or whether it's Robert E. Lee. It's white men, and the question is, you know, how do we deal with white men who have maybe done some good things, but have also been part of, have done bad things or embraced, you know, values that we find appalling. I want to suggest that there's other figures who are part of history as well, and we ought to put them in there too. Women, racial minorities, and I'm going to name two people and put two people in the hopper and ask, how do we feel about the memorialization of these two people? So person number one I'm going to put in the hopper is Malcolm X. There's Malcolm X Parks, there's Malcolm X Schools, there's a Malcolm X University, there was a Malcolm X stamp. Malcolm X is memorialized all across the United States of America. Malcolm X is highly esteemed in many precincts throughout America. Malcolm X was also a person who, for much of his adult life, said with tremendous enthusiasm and tremendous power that in his view, white people were devils, literally devils, the blue-eyed devils. He thought that intermarriage was just, racial intermarriage was just terrible, a type of poison. And for much of his life, he thought that you know, the best thing that could happen with respect to African Americans was that they could be as far away from white people as possible, because white people were basically, you know, were evil people. Well, against that backdrop, what do we think about the memorials to Malcolm X? If someone were to propose a Malcolm X memorial at, you know, this university, for instance, he spoke here a number of times. There are many people at this university who I think hold Malcolm X in high esteem. What should one say, given Malcolm X's long record of anti-white sentiment? Let me throw another person in the hopper, Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth was one of the stalwarts of the Second Reconstruction. Fred Shuttlesworth was the heart and soul of anti-racist resistance in Birmingham, Alabama. Fred Shuttlesworth was the person who invited Martin Luther King Jr. to come to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, which became in 1963 one of the great struggles of the Second Reconstruction. He now one of the greats of the civil rights movement. If you fly into Birmingham, Alabama today, you fly into the Fred Shuttlesworth International Airport. Question, you know, what does one think about that? Well, in the last decade of, last few years of Fred Shuttlesworth's life, he spent a considerable amount of time campaigning against gay liberation. He campaigned in favor of various laws, various ordinances in Ohio that would have actually prevented the passage of local ordinances to protect gay people. Now, this was part, this was part of his religious commitment, but one might, say, well, so what? I mean, segregation, or for that matter, slavery was part of the, was animated on the part of some people by religious commitment. Fred Shuttlesworth was an anti-gay activist. Again, question, against that backdrop, what does one say about the Fred Shuttlesworth Airport? What does that say about prospective efforts to memorialize Fred Shuttlesworth? And frankly, one could go on and on and on with figures, and it seems to me, in terms of trying to figure out what do we really think about memorials, how we should memorialize people in the past, the politics of memorialization, I would suggest that we need to diversify the cast of characters whom we discuss.
Yeah, as Sandy mentioned, in no small part as a consumer of his work. When the Dean Minow asked me to chair the committee to decide the fate of the law school crest, one of the first things I did was order 12 copies of the first edition of the book and put it together with a packet of reading. They distributed it to members of the committee, just to serve as a starting point for our discussions. And of course, one member of that committee, the Royal Professor of Law herself, is Janet Halley, is here. Hearing Randy's comments about the complexity, not simply of issues, but the complexity of people, and that people contain within themselves things that we would, from the outside, would regard as contradictions. Was reminded of a student had once in office hours when I was teaching at Wash U, an African-American student, who sat down, looked over my bookshelf, and right next to him was a new biography of Earl Warren. And he said, "Earl Warren, he did a lot for me." Pause, pause, pause. Then again, I'm not Japanese American. And so it's the complexity within people that we have to keep in mind. Now, I think Written in Stone is a marvelous book, not least because it affirms the importance of history. And of course, the importance of history is something that is near and dear to the hearts of historians. But more specifically, I think it's because it affirms that history is always contested. And it is contested because it is worth fighting for. Every statute, every monument, every plaque is an interpretive act presented as historical truth. And when people contest monuments, they are contesting what historical truth is, or what they think historical truth is. Now, this, of course, runs up against the truism that history is written and statutes and monuments are erected by the victors. But as historians know, this truism also applies to the thousands of statues and monuments, to the so-called lost cause of the Civil War, which would seem to be memorials by and for the losers, until you realize that most of them were erected only after the South had effectively risen again, and persuaded people of the nobility of their cause, and effectively rewriting history by reading honor and states' rights in and reading slavery out. And monuments are ostensibly about commemorating the past, but they are really about enshrining what the people who erected them thought about the past. And that is why the context of the period in which the Civil War monuments were erected matter. During the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 19th, early 20th century, during the Civil Rights era, the 1950s and 60s. And because they enshrine what the people who erected them thought about the past, those monuments exist in the multiple contexts. They exist in the context that they refer to and are ostensibly memorializing. They exist in the context in which they were dedicated, the context of the people who thought those acts worth memorializing. And they exist in the context in which they are viewed by subsequent generations, which includes the people often of very different backgrounds, very different beliefs, many of whom their ancestors were affected very differently by the people and acts commemorated. And this is why those monuments, those statues raise multiple questions of history. So I just want to mention briefly what I think those questions are and how they fit into Sandy's book. I mean, the first question of history is what is the history of a symbol and its meaning? And it's hardly surprising that symbols can mean different things to different people at different times. But the difficulty with those symbols arises when they mean different things to arises in the present when the symbol means different things to different people at the same time. And that's the point of contest. And the question then becomes whose truth, in quotation marks, prevails. Historians have a very different understanding of truth than non-historians do. The historians know that the certain truth is never discoverable. All we can do is try to get closer and closer and closer. But that fine distinction is generally, our attitude toward truth is generally not shared by people who contest monuments and statues. I think a second question of history is how we engage the past. I mean, historians engage the past to help us understand who we once were, how we became who we are now, and for some, how we can strive toward better versions of our collective selves in the future. Now, for historians, it is both a professional and a moral imperative to confront the past clearly and unflinchingly, and to teach the past to the present and for the future. That is what we historians do. But that raises the question of what role should a symbol, a statue or a monument, play in that engagement? Should it remain as a constantly visible reminder of past injustices within our own social, cultural, political histories or DNA? Should it remain as a spur to work toward bending the arc of history toward justice? Or should it be removed because its presence inhibits the discussion, because its presence is too vivid a reminder of or continues the impositions of injustice? And a third question of history is what to do when the symbolic representations of history offend present members of the community. In the case of Civil War monuments, by celebrating past oppressions, and by implication, celebrating, and sometimes by intention, present discriminations. But engagement with the past is not simply a historian's imperative. It is a democratic imperative. But that engagement does not require us to keep every monument to the past, but it does require us to decide what to keep, what to remove, and why. And those are the questions that Sandy probes in the book, provocatively, penetratively, and with his customary, instinctive ability to come up with the hypothetical and counter-argument after another until he has turned you completely around, and you marvel at the complexity of it all. So the book, Written in Stone, is a historian's delight, but it's also a primer for civic engagement in a democracy. And the question, though, becomes is that the conversations that these monuments engender, they never occur in periods of calm, never occur in periods of quiet reflection. They always occur in moments of contest. And they occur very loudly at moments when it is very increasingly difficult to have the kind of examination that these issues require. So read the book in a moment of calm, if any exists.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I guess if you live long enough, you experience anything, including getting to share a table with 3 Harvard law professors. I think this is a terrific book. I actually read the original version first before reading picking up the very confusingly repaginated 20th century edition. I had gotten the earlier copy, and it was filled with all of my little stickies, and then I wanted to transfer the stickies to the new edition and realized they weren't the same page. But I have to say, in addition to agreeing with what others have said about the book, it's thoughtful, it's subtle, it's sharp without being harsh, and really does probe in such a measured way some of the most painful and difficult issues that societies deal with. But I have to say, Sandy, what impressed me the most was reading how you were expected to turn in a 5,000 word afterward, and it turned into a 17,000 word, and now you say a 20,000 word. If you only knew what I have to go through with my editors to get an extra 150 words once in a while. One of the things about the book that fascinates me is how global these issues are. I was in Taiwan not too long ago, where there's a whole debate taking place in Taiwanese society over the role of Chiang Kai-shek, the founder of the modern state of Taiwan, and how he should be remembered. And in some circles, it has gotten so controversial to speak well of Chiang Kai-shek, who, in addition to many great things, was also responsible for terrible massacres, that at the university that he founded, the gift shop bears nothing with the name of Chiang Kai-shek on it. It's an indication of how powerfully and how dramatically reversed the impression of people and issues and causes can be. And you don't have to go all over the world. We have some of these issues right here at home, and maybe in the course of the time today, we can talk about some of the controversies that are taking place right here in Greater Boston. Just in the last few months, the renaming of Yaki Way, the street on which Fenway Park is located, and a deep controversy or I think it will become an even deeper controversy about whether Faneuil Hall should be renamed. There was a protest in Faneuil Hall just this past Sunday. Peter Faneuil, who donated the building and was a prominent merchant in Boston in the 18th century, was also an active slave trader. And there are a lot of people who argue with, I think, cogent reasons that however much time has passed, whether that name belongs on one of Boston's most famous buildings is really appropriate. So I hope we can talk about what's happening here in Boston as well, but I do want to focus on the question of the Confederate flag. This is a topic that I've written a column for. The earliest one that I could find that I'd written about was 22 years ago, when David Beasley, who you discuss in the book, was the governor of South Carolina and had called for removing the flag from flying above the State House. And he was bitterly excoriated for it, savagely excoriated for it, a Republican, and in the end, he was defeated. He was thrown out of office. And I'll just tell you as an aside, before I get to the point that I wanted to make, around the same time, I had written a couple of columns complaining about the Kennedy Library, which gives out this annual Profile and Courage Award to someone that the Kennedy family chooses. And I wrote a couple of columns complaining about the fact that the only people that the Kennedy family ever seems to honor with the Profile and Courage Award are these ardent liberals who were very obnoxious about something and ended up losing office. And I got a phone call from the director of the program who said, well, why don't you suggest someone? And I said, how about David Beasley, the governor of South Carolina, who's going to lose his seat because he has proposed taking down the Confederate battle flag from over the South Carolina state legislature. And I mean, I'm used to my advice being, politely, sometimes not so politely listened to and then ignored, starting at home. I was amazed when a couple of years later, David Beasley actually received a Profile and Courage Award. So if I've done some good in the world, maybe it was that. In his memoir, Ulysses S. Grant wrote about the experience of accepting the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox in 1865. And there's a passage in there that jumped out at me when I saw it. He wrote, I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought and for which there was the least excuse. I do not question, however, the sincerity of the great mass of those who were opposed to us. What I think is so great about that quote is that it's got, in those two sentences, the three key points that seem to come up over and over again in this debate about the Confederate flag and the Confederate monuments. He makes three crucial points. Point one, most of the supporters of the Confederacy were entirely sincere. Point two, Southerners fought with genuine valor and honor and courage and suffered greatly, many of them, for the cause. But point three, nevertheless, that cause was deeply wicked and inexcusable. I have thought for at least these 22 years that when it comes to the question of public monuments and the flag of the Confederacy, that points 1 and 2 are more than trumped, more than overwhelmed by point 3. Yes, there's much to esteem in Southern history and culture. Yes, the men and boys who followed that battle flag into the field fought in many cases with great valor and honor and suffered terribly. But point 3, that flag is an emblem of the most poisonous ideologies in our national history. Not just the preservation of slavery, but also, as you point out in the book, and as Bruce just mentioned, but also the defense of Jim Crow and segregation. A lot of these monuments to the Confederacy went up in the first decade of the 20th century. The daughters of the, what are they called? The daughters of the Confederate? Yep. Confederate daughters, whatever. We're putting up these monuments all over the country, especially all over the South. And as I didn't know until I read the book, it wasn't until the day that Robert F. Kennedy flew down to Alabama to meet with George Wallace that the flag was raised above the Alabama state legislature for the first time. So it isn't just slavery, it's also segregation and racial oppression in the modern era that flag represents. And it seems to me that the removal of that flag and the removal of those monuments is a matter of moral hygiene and not just a question of historical accuracy and historical honesty. Obviously, everyone who appreciates or reveres or admires or wears the Confederate flag isn't a racist. Or a white supremacist. But that doesn't change the fact, at least it seems to me, that flag and those monuments, first and foremost, are indeed symbols of racial bigotry and oppression. But beyond that, it seems to me that the flag and those monuments are completely odious and unacceptable for another reason, one that I was actually surprised gets almost no mention in the book at all, and that's that they represent rebellion against the United States. The banner of the Confederacy was not just the banner of those who wanted to preserve slavery. It's not just the banner in the 1960s of those who were opposed to the Civil Rights Movement, but it's also the banner of those who committed slaughter, who killed tens of thousands of loyal American soldiers for the purpose of destroying the United States of America. And I don't know that there's any country in the world that would tolerate the erection of monuments to its traitors, or that would continue decades, continue for decades to allow the flying of the flag of that rebellion. You do have a passage in here from Frederick Douglass, which struck me. You quote him, or he said, "I'm not indifferent to the claims of her generous forgetfulness," by which I take it he meant that a country that is trying to stitch itself together should be willing to forget some things in the interest of maintaining or restoring a national unity. "But whatever else I may forget, I shall never forget the difference between those who fought to save the Republic and those who fought to destroy it." I think that there could not be more literally anti-American colors than the Confederate flag. By definition, it's an anti-American flag. And for that reason, as much as for the reasons of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation, it seems to me that that flag ought to be anathema. You mentioned once or twice Nazi monuments to Hitler, to the Nazis. And you write, as I think everyone would agree, of course no one in Germany, leaving aside, the tiny fringe of skinheads and neo-Nazis, but no respectable German would tolerate the notion that the swastika, the Nazi flag, should fly over government buildings today or be honored in public spaces. And it doesn't matter whether their parents or or grandparents fought for the Third Reich, whether they fought with valor and honor, whether their family suffered greatly. Any decent German today, from the former East Germany or West Germany, whether they were German Catholics or Protestants or Jews, no German today, no decent German believes that the symbols and the flags and the personalities of the Nazi era ought to be honored. And I mean, it may surprise you that I take an even harder line on this than you do, but it seems to me that ought to be the perspective that we bring to the Confederacy. It was, as Grant said, the most shameful cause for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. I think that flag belongs nowhere in our public spaces. Obviously, it's a free country. You want to wear it on your shirt. You want to fly it in the front yard of your house. By all means, you should feel free to do so. But the idea that these monuments continue to have places of honor, I did know about the University of Texas and that flag, that huge monument with Jefferson Davis, towering over it. I just find that as shocking as I would find.
That's the state of Texas, not the University of Texas.
The Texas State Capitol. I think that we should regard all of those as absolutely outrageous, and you don't have to be Yankees sitting in Massachusetts to say it. I think that if you're a respectable Southerner, you should have some feeling of that as well. Obviously, good people can disagree about this, but it seems to me not that we've gone too far, and I'm someone who has railed time and again against political correctness, but I think this is not a case of being so politically correct that you throw out the good. I think we haven't been nearly correct enough, and that we allow these flags socially, if maybe it's not a legal issue, but that socially we tolerate them, and instead of regarding them as absolutely despicable.
Larry.
So I'm struck by the complexity of the problem of deciding how and whether to honor, especially going forward. So the one example that I'm constantly struggling with now on the Harvard campus is this monument to slavery that exists right out along the way to and the reason I'm struck by that is, it's erected self-consciously with humility. It's understated, and it's profoundly there. It's a huge rock. And if you know that history, you kind of appreciate the meaning of it in that context. But if you don't know much about the history, you walk around this area and you see all these huge statues to people, grand and glorious bits of art, and then you come to a rock honoring slavery, and you're like, well, what's the meaning of that? Like, why does slavery get honored or recognized or remembered in this way versus a way that's more profound? And so I'm wondering how you advise preserving, in some sense, the original meaning or the original intent in the context of these utterances against later reflections or anxieties about how they might strike the reader at a time that's removed from the context in which they're asserted.
Yeah, in the book, I describe the rock as demure. And it wasn't until actually literally a couple days ago, I was wandering around there, and I noticed a quite impressive monument, or whatever one wants to call it, to Mr. Cumble, who apparently gave the money to, kind of prepare the square, and it's much more visible and more impressive, at least in terms of size. Now, obviously, this is not intended, but, as somebody who's extremely grateful for the affiliation I have with the Harvard community, but is not, of it in the same sense you are, I can have a certain sense of detachment and curiosity. But let me stop there and ask the people who are more fully part of the community about this.
Yeah. Well, of course, I mean, that rock with the plaque. I mean, one of the questions left over, or that the Shield Committee did not address, was, I mean, we did say that the law school must engage this part of its history, which the law school does in a variety of ways. Now, the committee, deliberately chose not to say how it should do that, and so that rock, that plaque, the language of which was written by Annette Gordon Reed, who was a member of the committee, sort of part of an overall sort of recognition, acknowledgement, the hope for continued engagement. But the part that you're mentioning is it really is it's inherent in the word monument itself. When one thinks of monument, one thinks of monumentality, one thinks of size. It's in your face. And yet so many plaques and recognitions and smaller things kind of just fade into the background, and people cease to be aware of them as they walk by, and then discover them and start asking questions about them. And that difference seems to reflect the vagaries and subtleties of memory itself. Some memories are large and vigorous, others are smaller, they lend themselves to quiet reflection. I don't think that just one statue, one monument can speak for all of what it is supposed to represent. I think it has to be woven into a fabric of other recognitions. And so, for example, with respect to the sort of the founding story, as it's called, of Harvard Law School and the use of the royal funds, the part of that fabric is what the dean tells everyone else section at the opening dinner about the royal family, about the fact that they derived their money from sugar plantations and the labor of enslaved persons, and use that as a reminder that although that activity was perfectly legal, what is legal is not necessarily just, and using it to urge students to pursue justice. Or another part of the fabric is, to the extent, if any, that what Professor Halley tries to weave in the royal house and slave quarters out in Medford. And that's inherent in their being that they're part of a narrative, whereas with single monumental monuments, it is a single in-your-face statement. And putting aside the question of how do you agree on what that monumental sculpture should be, and the landscape everywhere is littered with seriously bad aesthetic choices. It's the how one engages.
Yes. Oh, Larry, then over there.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. I was thinking about both the notion of monumentality and my very strong agreement with Jeff about those monuments that, in my view, unambiguously don't belong as public celebrations. And I was thinking of the smallest monument I know of, the license plate. And the case that most intrigued me in this area was one in which it's quite ambiguous whether it's a public monument or a private statement. And when the Supreme Court confronted that in Walker against Sons of Confederate Veterans, it came out with a rather strange set of opinions, with Justice Breyer for the majority saying, this is government speech, and if the government chooses not to let people put, not just on their T-shirts where they would have a right, but on their license plates, which are government property, the Confederate flag, that's fine. And Justice Alito for the dissent saying, it's not government speech when you see all these cars whizzing by celebrating football teams other than those of Texas. No one thinks that the Republic of Texas is celebrating other teams. How does your thinking about public monuments sort of transmute itself when you're thinking about the gray area between the public and the private? I mean, I would think we would agree that if Jeff is right, that there ought not to be Confederate flags flying officially in front of a Capitol, that for the government even to allow a Confederate license plate might raise a question, but under the Breyer theory, it raises no question at all, because the government can speak in a racist way if it wants. Anyway, that's a question that occurred to me, and maybe you have some thoughts.
Right. Texas, I think, was in a thoroughly awkward or schizoid position, because on the one hand, it argued that the license plate was government speech, and the state of Texas certainly didn't want to be affiliated in any way with a suggestion of the legitimacy of the Confederacy. On the other hand, there's this. And let me assure you that there is no effort from those who now control the state of Texas politically to get rid of this. And this is only one of 3 monuments to the Confederacy on the Texas state capitol grounds. And I have to say, one of the things that disappointed me about the working press in 2000 is that the then Texas Governor, George Bush, was allowed to dodge the issue of the South Carolina flag by saying it's a local issue. No journalist thought to ask him, okay, you're not a South Carolinian, you know, let South Carolinians decide what to do, but what about this? And you know, he just got a free ride on that aspect of Texas. So, you know, I think that whole case is kind of bizarre, beginning with the posture of the state of Texas and then this 5-4 opinion that basically says that you can't force the state of Texas kind of to further embarrass itself, but without presenting a very good reason why. Yeah, you had your hand up.
I had a question kind of building off Mr. Jacoby's comment and phrasing of the term moral hygiene. I think something like the Confederacy, or an idea generally, you could probably reduce to a series of propositions and statements that we can judge as good or bad or true or false. But human character is not like that. And we are in this very odd moment where in some ways we are taking a broader sense of who is a valuable member of a community in things like criminal justice reform. You know, Brian Williamson has said, you are more than the worst thing you've ever done in your life. In other ways, particularly related to power, and maybe this just turns on power, we are taking a much, much more conservative view on who is a valuable member of our community, and whether outside conduct somehow detracts from the value that they bring, let's say in the arts or in some other capacity. And there's definitely an American impulse towards this Puritanism. and a desire for purity. And I worry about that because so often the people who are most likely to be claiming that this is a very, very moral thing to do seem to be judged poorly in the past, like the Puritans. And George Carlin once said, it's not people who get up, who get stoned all day who are causing the world's problems. It's people who get up early in the morning. And I worry with this. I mean, how far does this go? So let's take a person like Caravaggio. Caravaggio is a murderer. I mean, yeah, he creates chiaroscuro, but he's a murderer. And I worry when we're talking about people, it's different than the flag. And I just would love your thoughts on that. Because people are complicated, and maybe these are the kinds of discussions where one can say, yeah, it's complicated, and it's more suited towards literature or a book. But these are public conversations, like Professor Mann stated. And in some ways, it just draws me towards I want absolute rules because it's too complicated. No public memorialization or never tear down anything until it runs out in a conservation aspect. So I'm just curious on your thoughts.
I got 1,000 thoughts on that. I think you actually go to the heart of what, in many ways, is the most, the hardest issue to grapple with here. You're right. Almost nobody is only the worst thing that they've ever done. I do take this hard, absolute line on the Confederacy, on the Confederate flag, as I would on Nazism and the swastika. But I don't extrapolate from that to say that therefore anyone who once owned a slave must therefore be, have obloquy heaped on his head forever and ever. In the town, I live in Brookline, which recently renamed a school, the Edward Devotion School, an elementary and middle school, that had been named for one of the town stalwarts back in the 1700s. Edward Devotion was one of the prominent figures of Brookline society. When he died, he gave the greatest gift to the town of Brookline, the largest bequest ever made to the town in the entire century. During his lifetime, he was extremely active in town works, and he was very famous, particularly well known for his interest in education. At some point, people in Brookline thought when they built the school, it would be nice to name a school for Edward Devotion. And generations of Brookline families have sent their kids to the Devotion School. His name was stripped from the school in this past year because he also owned one slave. Now, he died in 1740 at a time when slavery was legal everywhere in the world, I would say. It certainly was legal in Massachusetts, and it was not even controversial. So I would say it's one thing to say that the flag of the Confederacy, the flag that itself represents the preservation of slavery, should have no place in American public life. But to say that someone whose life was filled with good works, but who also, by standards that came into force after his own lifetime, behaved at least in one way that was not admirable, does that retroactively mean that does that mean that his name should retroactively be regarded as as something shameful? I wrote a long piece during the Edward Devotion and Yaki Way controversy, in which I said if we're going to start going down this road, there's no shortage. Caravaggio is a great example. I hadn't thought of that. But the arts, you're right, are filled with people who were monsters in many ways morally. And yet, I mean, one of the classic examples, Wagner was a raging anti-Semite. And yet he was also the composer of some of the greatest music, in the modern era. What about Ted Kennedy? On the campus of the University of Massachusetts, there's a an Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. Ted Kennedy was responsible for the death of an innocent woman in the Chappaquiddick incident. Anybody who looks at that today regards his behavior as completely shameful. Should that incident color everything else that he did in his life? Richard Russell was one of the greatest U.S. senators. The Russell Senate Office Building is named for him. He was regarded as the ultimate senator's senator. He was famed for his mastery of Senate procedure, the moving force behind a lot of great legislation, universally regarded as extremely courteous and decent in his dealings with his colleagues. Truly one of the great senators as measured by the senatorial job. He was also a raging racist, an absolute white supremacist who was bitterly opposed right into the 1960s. In fact, he broke with Lyndon Johnson, who had been his protege when Johnson turned out to be a great supporter of civil rights. Should the Russell Senate Office Building have Russell's name taken off because of So I agree with you. I don't think that there's any clear-cut answer to any of it, but it's all very, very yeasty and challenging and difficult, something to wrestle with.
I think Russell is a really interesting example. I think he's very much like John Calhoun, Calhoun was certainly a towering figure in early 19th century American politics. He was also a brilliant political theorist. He also devoted much of his life to reinforcing slavery and what we came to call the slavocracy. I think it's fair to say, in summing up Richard Russell's career, which was suitably complex, that he devoted enough of his life to entrenching white supremacy that they could find other people to name the building after. But he does present kind of an exquisite problem, because unless you accept the view, which isn't an insane view, it's simply a problematic view of the New Orleans school board or whatever it was quite a few years ago, that no school would be named after a slave owner, so that the George Washington School was renamed. That has for law students who spend their lives debating rules versus standards, that has the virtue of being a rule. And you can say, well, yeah, the rule is going to have some problematic applications, but it's even more problematic to decide which slave owners are okay and which are not. Politically, one can see why a rule would be preferable. But I think there are also good reasons to reject rules in favor of standards. But I do think that even under a quite generous standard, Russell is a problematic case. I would find him closer overall to Robert E. Lee than to Hugo Black, who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and who evolved, who changed. And I'd find it kind of bizarre for somebody to say that his membership in the Klan was a permanent bar to being honored. But I think this is what makes these controversies so interesting and politically volatile. Somebody, Janet Alley in back and then up front.
This is so fascinating. I just want to say thank you for the panel, and thank you, Bruce, for the little shout out about my being the royal chair. And I take tours out to Medford, to the Royal House and Slave Quarters, the actual home of Isaac Royal and the largest slave quarters in New England. I'll advertise to the community a couple tours in the spring and try to get as many people out there. I'm really gratified to see the size of this room, and you'll all be invited to engage in another way with the royal legacy at that time. We can't go now, it's too cold, it doesn't have heat. Okay, thank you.
Last question.
Okay, Elizabeth?
Hi, thank you. I'm not from the law school community, only by association. But I wanted to I haven't read your book yet, and I apologize if
Most people haven't.
Well, if this is totally off base, but I'm a landscape designer by profession. And monuments of all kinds in cemeteries, in the public spaces, particularly all over the world, past and present and future ones to be built, are a huge controversy in my field. And I have to say, I've come to the opinion that when you really dig down and try to figure out what, if anything, you're honoring and why you're even creating something, and is it just Western tradition to be carving in stone, and that's why we do so much of it? Why have it at all? I would prefer myself, being in landscape, to have only things that are ephemeral, and not things that go on and on way past their due date. Something that is created perhaps more in the heart of man, and to think about that rather than what is carved in stone.
Yeah, I think there's one deceptively easy answer to the question of why. And the subtitle of the book is Public Monuments and Changing Societies. But that's built on the fact that, quite literally from pharaonic times, what hegemonic elites do is to capture public space, to glorify themselves, and thus to create a certain kind of civic consciousness. And this is why so often you can measure a true regime change by some monuments coming down and others going up. So I have a discussion in the book of Heroes Square in Budapest, which, depending on your own historical perspective, is either a comedy or a tragedy with regard to heroes going up and then coming down when new regimes come into power. And I think that's a constant. My favorite monuments in the world are probably the Assyrian sculptures at the British Museum. I find them much more impressive than the Parthenon sculptures. But we know that Assyrian civilization is dead, dead, dead. And they're preserved in a museum, partly because they're just stunning aesthetically. And so one of the issues we inevitably confront is which monuments are really aesthetic objects. None of the pharaohs, I suspect, deserve to be honored in terms of, our agreement with pharaonic values.
Yeah.
But if you've ever been to, Karnak, they're really remarkable in every way. Or the various sculptures to the Medicis, who would not, under most metrics, deserve the honor they get. But when Michelangelo is your house sculptor, then it's going to be impressive. Or quite frankly, as Bruce knows, I have my qualms about Justice Story as the author of Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which I regard as the worst single opinion in our history. The first thing you see as you walk into Langdell is one of the great works of 19th century American sculpture. Most of the Confederate monuments, or most monuments generally, aren't particularly distinguished, but there are some that really are. And so at what point does aesthetics take over? I mean, to give up a Caravaggio merely because he was a murderer would be very different from giving up a painting by, a mediocre painting by an unknown, where you say, well, we're just not going to honor murderers. But all societies use their control of public space in order to generate a proper civic consciousness. And it would be truly unprecedented if some newly empowered hegemons said, either we're going to leave up the monuments to the czars or to Stalin or whoever, because we're so devoted to historic preservation, or we're going to take down all previous monuments and just allow trees to grow. That's just not the way hegemons think.
And if just very briefly, all of it, the point about hegemons, absolutely true. It's wonderful for a historian to watch it happening. But just one last thing on the benefit of the small, and the ability to how they can facilitate conversations across time, in part because they're not torn down and they remain. Charles Sumner, the leading anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, the nearly beaten to death on the floor of the Senate by Congressman Preston Brooks for insulting the honor of South Carolina and his uncle. There's a statue to Charles Sumner in Harvard Square. And Sumner is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. In the last time that I was out walking in Mount Auburn, came across his gravesite, which is just a stone sarcophagus. And there were stones placed on top in the manner of Jewish memorial stones. There was also a piece of paper that the ink was still visible, and someone had copied the poem Invictus. What are the lines? I forget. I am the master of my fate. Something like that. It's 19th century poem that shows up in the movies about South African rugby teams, and other such things. And at the end, whoever had copied the poem added, and this was last fall, nevertheless he persisted. And Elizabeth Warren occupies Charles Sumner's seat. And so it was just an extraordinary moment, capturing a moment of effectively of a conversation across time. And that is part of the power of the memorial symbols that we choose to keep. And sometimes those conversations can only be answered by a sledgehammer. At other times, they're answered by continuing conversation.
One last word about Malcolm X, because I did hear Malcolm X when he spoke at Quincy House in probably 1965 or 66. How much does the answer to your question depend on the fact that late in life he became what many people believe was a very different person? So you could, in fact, talk about the early Malcolm X, who did indeed believe that all whites were devils, and the later post-Hajj Malcolm X, who had what sounded like a more humane and inclusive view. He was not less of a political radical, but it was just different from the Malcolm X, say, of 1958. So when one memorializes Malcolm X, which of the Malcolm X's is being memorialized, or do you just say, well, all individuals are complicated? I mean, I drive by the Yaki Center for Cancer Research quite often. I think Yaki probably was a racist, as proved by the fact that I gather he passed on Jackie Robinson as a possible member of the Boston Red Sox. But he also clearly was a marvelous philanthropist with regard to seeking cures for cancer, and that can't be denied. I mean, it seems renaming Yawkey Way by Fenway Park is fine because the Red Sox were clearly hurt by his racism. It would be more complicated, I think, with regard to saying, well, let's remove Yawkey from the cancer center, unless you discovered that he wanted treatment only for white sufferers. But I've never seen,
No,
any-
in fact, the evidence that Yaki was actually a racist it's skimpy at best. The Red Sox were the last team to call up a black player from the minor leagues, and it's true, Jackie Robinson was not anyone that they were interested in hiring. The evidence, though, that Tom Yawkey himself was actually racist as opposed to just simply not interested in the question. I don't know. I actually challenged the change, the name change. It was pushed, as you may know, by John Henry, who is not only the owner of the Boston Red Sox, but also the owner of the Boston Globe. So, they do allow me a certain amount of latitude, and I get to challenge even the owner. I actually, the test that I would propose, and I wonder what you think of it, and I don't know how much, if we're running out of time. The test that I propose, at least when the question is, should something be renamed or been removed, is a two-part one. Maybe this goes to your rules versus standards, but here's a possible rule. I'm curious to know what you think. Number one, was the person honored for something that was indecent and disreputable? Two, is the person today primarily known for something that was indecent and disreputable? So in the case of George Washington, the answer is no on both counts. Certainly, George Washington is not honored because he was an indecent person who did horrible things, and that's not how he's primarily remembered today. By that, dual rule, I would say George Washington's name shouldn't come off of anything. Tom Yaki or Edward Devotion, to take these local cases, Peter Fannell, certainly they weren't honored for the reason that they were honored. Yaki Way wasn't named for Tom Yaki because of his benighted racial views. Edward Devotion School wasn't named for Edward Devotion because he once owned a slave. So certainly leg one of that test would be no problem. Are these people primarily known today? Even then, in both cases, I would say probably not. Maybe Richard Russell is a different example. But I just wonder, I throw that out as a possible way to at least navigate the minefield of standards changing, and whether honor should be taken away from someone because of that.
I'm sure we could, in fact, spend all afternoon on that question and others, but I suspect that you have other things to do, and our contract on this room